have been some criticism of some media coverage of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. Many media houses, especially in Europe, are being accused of bias in favor of Israel and for failing to tell the Palestinian story fairly. The Minister of International Relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor, is among those who slammed the lack of fairness, saying Al Jazeera was one of the few giving balanced reporting of the bloody conflict. We're now joined in studio by Thandi Smith, who is the head of programs at Newzroom Afrika, to reflect on this. Thandi, thank you for making time for us. Good morning.
Good afternoon.
It is afternoon.
It is afternoon.
Indeed. So, you know, it's often said that the first casualty of war is the truth. And I wonder what your reflections have been. Let's just look broadly of how the world has been reporting on this conflict in the Middle East. How has the media fared?
Yeah, I think that, you know, we're dealing with such an unbelievably sensitive topic when it comes to the conflict. And what seems to be lacking in the media coverage very broadly, very generally, is you're not seeing a lot of condemnation of the actual violence and the repercussions of war. We seem to be very focused on, you know, media taking one side or the other, and, you know, that going back to the very basics of good quality ethical journalism seems to be missing. I think that media seem to be, you know, quite anxious to tell one side or the other, and it becomes very difficult. We are seeing some balanced reporting, or some attempts at balanced reporting, but I think it is fair to say that, you know, it is very difficult to have that nuance when you're dealing with such a complex, complicated issue.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that a lot of media houses have really been struggling to strike that balance. Is it possible to even be balanced when you're reporting on something like this, where sometimes there's funders of organizations that have their own views, that have their own sides, that may start tickling in, and that is, of course, interference, but they start, what their views are, start tickling in on how the station itself covers these stories. So how difficult has it been for the media to strike that balance because of the link to some organizations that may be funding these institutions?
Well, you know, I think when you talk about media and ownership and funding and the views, we seem to want to have this, you know, ideal world where there's a complete separation of powers between ownership and interests and actual news reporting and topics and coverage. And there should be that separation, you know. You shouldn't get any kind of influence from the ownership top level on editorial content. But I also think that when it comes to such heightened emotions and heightened politics, that it is difficult to, you know, not have some kind of subjective view on a position. The big issue here is about transparency. So, you know, imagine if we had a look at the media coverage and journalists or media say, you know what, this is how we're going to be covering the conflict. This is what our interests are, and this is what our bias is, and so our approach is going to be slanted like this. So when you watch our coverage, make sure you understand that from a critical perspective, like from a critical position, whether, you know, whatever side you're looking at. But what we also tend to forget is that it's, you know, we're dealing with conflict, we're dealing with politics, and we're not looking at the real human tragedy here, which are the victims of war. You know, we're not looking at condemning violence. War is never a good thing. We're looking at a very bad, you know, situation. And so it is very difficult to find that nuance, but it's about being transparent about your bias.
Yeah, I mean, my personal observations of for instance, Western media was, I mean, you started seeing Al Jazeera, which was probably pretty clear of where it stands. I mean, you see their headlines, they call it the war on Gaza. You look at the institutions like CNN that calls it the Israeli war or Israeli-Hamas war. So there are certain things that just by merely looking at, you know, the straps, the headlines, you get a sense of where the station probably is getting towards. But do you think that the media has done a good job at actually telling that human story? Because yes, tensions are high. This is a contentious issue. I mean, this has been going on for over 70 years. Do you think the media has done a good job at also just telling that human story on the ground? Because at the end of the day, the war doesn't benefit anyone.
Yeah.
In fact, the civilians are the ones who suffer the most, and it's their stories that need to be told.
I don't think the media is doing a good enough job of telling us the whole story. I don't think media does a good enough job of telling, you know, the whole story of any conflict in the world. Just you just look at our continent. You know, there are many conflicts, a great loss of human life on our continent, and we don't hear those stories. So media do tend to jump to where it is newsworthy and what's interesting to the public. But again, I don't think we're getting the full human story when we're looking at the Israel-Hamas conflict here. And I think we're seeing the aftermath of everything. People aren't interrogating or being given the option to understand the complexities, and I think we're missing that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've observed is how when the public reacts to how they think the media institution has been reporting, whether fairly or unfairly, they start reacting as well. I saw with CNN, for instance, which was accused of not even sending enough resources on the Palestinian side in Gaza for their reporters to report on that front. Most of the anchors have mostly been in Israel. And the impression from some members of the public was, we can see which side you are on. What I started seeing after that was that reporters on the ground who would be going to cover a Palestinian protest, they started getting harsh treatments from some Palestinians or people who sympathize with Palestine, because they say your institution is not telling our story. They're siding with Israel. So where I'm getting at here with it is there's danger on the reporters on the field as well when media institutions are perceived to be for or against Israel or Palestine. They feel that brunt on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, again, it goes back to, one of the comments initially around the public wanting media to take a position. And it's not media's job to take a position on this. It's media's job to offer that balanced, fair, accurate,
and you decide for yourself.
Exactly. And so I do think it's unfair to expect media to take a side. But when media are clearly taking a side, it does become difficult. We see examples of that happening, right on our doorstep, where media are targeted by public for not telling their stories. And so I don't think this is only an issue that relates to this particular war. I think this is a relationship with media, their audience, the public, and those in power. Generally, I think it's very representative of the tensions between public and media.
Yeah. I mean, one of the frustrations, as anchors, as presenters, as media practitioners, and I wonder what your impressions of the local media has been in reporting on this conflict, because we are so far removed, right? We're not on the ground. Yes, we are relying on other institutions, on Reuters, on reporters from other international organizations that are on the ground. But part of the frustration is that even when you bring in experts to interview, it's very difficult to find an expert who is quote-unquote neutral. It's either black or white. So at the end of the day, you bring in an expert who may be sympathizing with Israel, an expert who may sympathize with Palestine, and that muddies the waters because someone who's watching from home feels their story is not told. How do you think we've fared as the local media in reporting about a conflict that is not just so complex, but that's happening so far away from home?
So far away, complex, and very emotional for a lot of people, and very rightly so. And I think it has been a particularly interesting challenge for our local media because, like you say, you have to look at international media to get a lot of the information. So it becomes not necessarily around on-the-ground reporting, but it becomes what international feeds do you choose to use as your sources of information, which then in itself is a secondary source of information. And so it does become very difficult. So I think that, I don't want to say local media are doing a very good job or very bad job. I think, unfortunately, it's one of those very complex scenarios where we are spending a lot of focus on this war. And, that I think should be the question, and very rightly so. But there's, again, so much that we're not talking about.
What lessons do you think we can learn from this conflict and how just the media globally has been reporting? How do we do better? And hopefully we won't have to report about another war in the future. Touch wood.
So what's interesting about the coverage of this particular conflict is that we see a lot of the victims of war being women, being children. And we don't see that coverage coming out of other conflict areas as much. If you look at the coverage of the war between Russia and Ukraine, you know, we're not telling the stories of the soldiers who are on the ground, the victims. You know, we see soldiers as the aggressors, as the people waging war, but we're not looking at the victims, the soldiers who are victims. You know, let's look at the broader casualties of war. We're looking at a lot of, like I said, attention on children, attention on women, and you have to ask yourself, yes, the stories have to be told and need to be told, but is that playing on our emotions as well? So it's about finding that balance, and it's about going into the broader complexities and reasons and sort of unpacking what is going on, and not just looking at the devastation, the aftermath, and the actual violence of the war, because that's not the only story to be told.
Thandi Smith, thank you so much for joining us for this chat. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.